In 1965, a trade group called the Sugar Research Foundation initiated something it labeled Project 226. The project was straightforward. Commission a literature review from credentialed Harvard scientists, have the review published in a prestigious medical journal, and ensure the review reached a specific conclusion: that dietary fat, not sugar, was the primary dietary driver of heart disease. The scientists were paid approximately $6,500. They submitted their bibliography to the foundation for review. They showed their manuscript to the foundation before publication. And when the two-part review appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967, it disclosed no funding source. The readers of that journal, physicians, researchers, policymakers, had no way to know that the conclusions they were reading had been shaped by the industry whose product was being exonerated. This is not speculation. In 2016, a researcher named Kristen Kearns and her colleagues at the University of California, San Francisco published a forensic analysis of the Sugar Research Foundation's internal documents in JAMA Internal Medicine. The correspondence was archived at the University of Illinois. The letters were real. The canceled checks were real. The editorial suggestions from the foundation to the scientists were documented in the scientists' own files. This video is educational. Everything cited here comes from peer-reviewed research and primary source documents accessible in university archives. This is not dietary advice. For personal nutrition decisions, a registered dietitian or physician is the appropriate partner. What those documents reveal is a transaction, not a theory about a transaction. A transaction with names, dollar amounts, and a paper trail. The Harvard scientists were D. Mark Hegsted, Frederick Stair, and Robert McGandy. The review they produced concluded that dietary fat and cholesterol were the primary dietary culprits in coronary heart disease, and that sugar's role was negligible. The Sugar Research Foundation had paid for that conclusion, reviewed the work that produced it, and remained invisible in the published result. You might think this is where the story ends. A single, compromised review from the 1960s. But Hegsted's career continued. By 1977, he was an administrator at the United States Department of Agriculture, and he helped draft the dietary goals for the United States, the first federal document to set specific macronutrient targets for the American diet. The same scientist whose literature review had been funded and shaped by the sugar industry was now helping write the nation's dietary policy. The documents do not tell us whether Hegsted's policy work was influenced by his earlier relationship with the Sugar Research Foundation. They tell us it happened. They tell us the conflict of interest existed. And they tell us no one in the public or the policy community knew about it until 2016. Here is something the simplified version of this story often leaves out. The 1977 dietary goals did recommend reducing sugar consumption to approximately 15% of calories. The document was not a blanket endorsement of sugar. It told Americans to eat less fat and less sugar. But what the food industry did with that guidance is where the story turns from documents in an archive to products on your grocery shelf. When the food industry reformulated products to reduce fat, it faced a practical problem. Fat carries flavor and texture. Remove it, and the product becomes unpalatable. The industry's solution was not to replace fat with vegetables or whole grains. It replaced fat with sugar, refined starches, and processed carbohydrates. That was a commercial decision, not a government directive. And it is written on every ingredient label from the 1980s and 1990s. The era of fat-free cookies with more sugar than the originals, reduced fat yogurt sweetened to compensate, salad dressings where corn syrup filled the space that oil once occupied. The food industry did not misunderstand the guidelines. It optimized for profit within them. What happened next to the American diet is documented in federal nutrition surveys. NHANES data analyzed by Briefel and Johnson in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition shows that between 1971 and 2000, the percentage of calories Americans consumed from fat declined from roughly 37% to 33%. But total caloric intake increased substantially. For women, approximately 22% over that period. Carbohydrate intake rose. The dietary shift was real, measurable, and population-wide. During approximately the same decades, obesity prevalence in the United States roughly tripled, from around 14% of adults in the early 1970s to approximately 30% by 2000, according to NHANES data published in JAMA by Flegel and colleagues. Type 2 diabetes prevalence rose dramatically over the same period per CDC surveillance data. Now, and this matters, I am not telling you that the Sugar Research Foundation's 1967 payment caused the obesity epidemic. That would be a cleaner story than the evidence supports. The same period saw declines in physical activity, the rise of ultra-processed food broadly, increases in portion sizes, urbanization patterns, and socioeconomic shifts in food access. The dietary shift is one documented contributor among several. The honest framing is, the obesity epidemic accelerated during the same period that dietary guidance shifted toward lower fat consumption and food industry reformulation increased sugar content. Isolating a single cause from that complexity is not something the evidence allows. But the timing is striking, and the mechanism is documented. There is a moment in this history that I want you to sit with. In the 1960s, a research team at the University of Minnesota conducted one of the largest controlled dietary experiments of the era, the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. It involved over 9,000 participants in mental institutions and nursing homes. It specifically tested whether replacing saturated fat with vegetable oil would reduce heart disease. The results showed it did not. In some subgroups, the intervention appeared to increase mortality. Those results were not published. They sat in a basement for nearly 50 years. In 2016, the principal investigator's son and a team of researchers recovered the original data and published their reanalysis in the BMJ. The data had not been hidden by conspiracy. No one had locked a door, but no one had gone looking either. And had those results been published in the 1970s, during the period when fat was being condemned as the primary dietary villain, the conversation might have been different. The science eventually corrects itself. It does not always correct itself on time. Let me address a claim that circulates in the opposite direction, one you may have encountered on podcasts or social media channels that took this documented history and ran past the evidence with it. The claim is that sugar is uniquely metabolically destructive, that it functions essentially as a metabolic poison independent of its caloric content. This framing draws on real biochemistry. Fructose metabolism in the liver is genuinely different from glucose metabolism, but the population-level evidence does not support the unique toxicity version. A 2013 systematic review and meta-analysis in the BMJ by Temorenga, Mallard, and Mann specifically examined sugar and body weight. They found that when sugar was swapped for other macronutrients at the same caloric level, there was no effect on weight. Sugar's documented effect on weight operates primarily through excess caloric intake. It is easy to overconsume. It appears in foods that encourage overconsumption, but calorie for calorie, it is not uniquely fattening. This matters because replacing the old single villain narrative, fat is the problem, with a new single villain narrative, sugar is the problem, replicates the same structural error. The documented corruption of the 1960s skewed the evidence toward one villain. Overcorrecting by anointing a replacement villain is not what the research supports. Pattern beats nutrient every time. The research that most complicates the single nutrient framing came from Kevin Hall's group at the National Institutes of Health, published in Cell Metabolism in 2019. In a tightly controlled inpatient trial, one of the few studies where researchers literally controlled every bite participants ate, people randomized to ultra-processed diets consumed approximately 500 more calories per day than those on unprocessed diets. They gained weight. The mechanism was not sugar specifically. It was the entire food matrix: texture, protein dilution, eating rate, palatability engineering. The relevant variable may not be any single ingredient on the label. It may be what has been done to the food before it reaches you. If you are standing in your kitchen right now, or in a grocery aisle later today, wondering what to do with this information, here is what the current evidence broadly supports, without prescription. The American Heart Association's 2021 scientific statement on dietary guidance emphasizes dietary patterns over single nutrients. The 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommend limiting added sugar to less than 10% of total calories, a position that represents a substantial shift from mid-20th century guidance that effectively ignored sugar. The AHA specifically identifies added sugar as a cardiovascular concern through its contribution to obesity, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. These guidelines are not perfect. The process that produces them still receives industry input, and researchers, including Kearns and Mozaffarian, have documented ongoing structural concerns. A 2013 systematic review in PLOS Medicine by Bess Rastrollo and colleagues found that industry-sponsored nutrition studies were approximately 7.5 times more likely to reach conclusions favorable to the sponsor than independently funded studies. That bias is documented in the current literature, not just the 1960s archive. The structural problem has been named. Whether it has been resolved is an ongoing debate among credentialed researchers. But here is what I want you to hold alongside that concern. The story of the 1967 Sugar Research Foundation documents is also the story of the 2016 Kearns paper. A researcher went into the archives. She found the correspondence. She published her findings in a peer-reviewed journal. Other scientists reviewed the evidence and confirmed it. The scientific process corrected itself, 50 years late, with friction against financial pressure. That is how science works when it works, even when it does not work on time. The lesson is not that you cannot trust science. The lesson is that you should always ask who funded it, who reviewed it before publication, and whether that funding was disclosed. If you have been through multiple dietary eras, if you were told in the 1990s to eat fat-free everything, told in the 2010s that fat was fine and carbs were the enemy, told last month by a podcast host that seed oils are destroying your cellular membranes, your fatigue is warranted. Your skepticism is earned. The pendulum has swung because commercial interests have pushed it, because media amplifies single studies as revolutions, and because nutrition science is genuinely difficult. It relies heavily on epidemiology with confounders and on trials that struggle to control what free-living humans actually eat. What has held up across the pendulum swings is this: dietary patterns matter more than any single nutrient. Whole foods, minimally processed vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, fish, and other protein sources your cultural tradition prepares have consistent evidence across multiple large cohort studies and multiple dietary traditions. The Mediterranean pattern, the DASH pattern, the traditional Japanese pattern. The specific ingredients differ. The structural similarity is consistent. Whole foods, prepared at home or by someone who prepared them from recognizable ingredients in moderate quantities. That is not a diet book. That is decades of converging evidence from different populations, different research traditions, and different continents. Food is culture before it is chemistry. If the food you grew up with, whether your grandmother's rice and beans, your family's Sunday roast, your mother's dal, your father's pasta, is being told to you by an influencer that it is wrong, there is a high probability that the influencer is selling something. Traditional food patterns evolved over generations within specific cultures and specific ecologies. They are not optimized by someone with a ring light and a supplement code. For individual questions, if you are managing diabetes or cardiovascular risk or a specific condition and trying to figure out what the evidence means for your body specifically, the evidence-trained professional for that conversation is a registered dietitian. That is a credentialed, regulated profession with specific training and licensure requirements. The word nutritionist is unregulated in most states. Anyone can use it regardless of training. The credential to look for, if you want individualized guidance grounded in evidence, is RD or RDN. I want to return, briefly, to the documents, because there is something in the Kearns paper that is easy to miss if you read only the headlines. The Sugar Research Foundation did not just shape one literature review. A follow-up paper by Kearns and colleagues in PLOS Medicine in 2017 documented that the SRF had funded a dental caries study at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and terminated the funding in 1969 when preliminary results suggested the study would conclude that sugar was a primary cause of dental cavities and that reducing sugar consumption was the solution. The foundation killed the study before it could publish. Two different research questions, two different institutions, two different forms of interference, shaping in one case, suppression in the other. A pattern documented across a 4-year span. The parallel to the tobacco industry is not rhetorical. It appears in peer-reviewed literature. Kelly Brownell and Kenneth Warner published a systematic comparison in the Millbank Quarterly in 2009, documenting shared strategies, commissioning research to manufacture scientific controversy, using front organizations, emphasizing personal responsibility to deflect systemic attention, lobbying to delay regulation, targeting children in marketing. The Doubt is Our Product memo from the tobacco industry's Brown and Williamson documents, a real document archived at UCSF, articulated the strategy explicitly in 1969. The sugar industry's documented actions fit the same structural pattern. This is not an analogy. It is a documented parallel that peer-reviewed researchers have specifically analyzed. The science did eventually correct itself. 50 years late. The current dietary guidelines now explicitly address added sugar. The FDA's updated Nutrition Facts Panel, finalized in 2016, requires added sugars to be listed separately, a regulatory change that makes visible what was once buried in total carbohydrate counts. These are measurable policy shifts that emerged from the same scientific process that was corrupted in the 1960s, operating slowly, imperfectly, toward correction. You do not need to eliminate sugar from your life. That is not what the evidence supports, and it is not what I am suggesting. What the evidence supports is awareness of how much added sugar appears in processed foods you may not think of as sweet, of how industry interests have historically shaped what you were told about your diet, and of the difference between a dietary pattern built around whole foods and a dietary pattern built around products engineered for overconsumption. The diet book is not the same thing as the evidence. What I want you to carry out of this is not fear, not a new set of foods to avoid, not another pendulum swing. What I want you to carry is a question, a simple one. applicable to every nutrition claim you encounter from this point forward. Who funded this? Was it disclosed? And does the conclusion happen to benefit the funder? That question would have changed the trajectory of American dietary policy in 1967. It is still the right question now. Comment with the nutrition claim you have encountered most often that you suspect does not hold up under scrutiny. The one that sounds authoritative but never comes with a citation. Subscribe if you want evidence without diet prescriptions, without supplement pitches, without moralizing. The next video will take the same approach to a different claim. The documents will be cited, the sources will be named, and you will decide what to do with them.